"The main table is for real family," Daniel Harper said, his smile thin and polished as crystal, the words floating above the rooftop like a verdict already decided. The private dining floor of the Manhattan high-rise shimmered under warm gold lighting, 70 stories above the city, where traffic below looked like slow-moving sparks. A long white linen table stretched across the center of the room, set with imported orchids and $300 a bottle Napa Valley Cabernet, every place card written in looping calligraphy. At the far end, beneath a chandelier shaped like falling glass rain, Charlotte Bennett stood still, the skyline reflecting softly against the black silk of her dress. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The nearby relatives and business associates heard him clearly enough. A few exchanged glances. Someone let out a quiet laugh, the kind people make when they're relieved the spotlight isn't on them. Daniel gestured casually toward a smaller round table near the service station. "You'll be more comfortable there." Comfortable. The word hovered between them, dressed up as courtesy, but edged with exclusion. Charlotte's expression did not crack. She adjusted the delicate gold watch at her wrist, the only jewelry she wore, its face catching a line of chandelier light. Years ago, she had stood beside him at another long table, signing documents that secured his first commercial lease, pledging her savings so his business could survive its fragile first year. Back then, he had called her his foundation. Tonight, he called her a guest. The waitstaff moved quietly around them, refilling water glasses measured to the ounce, placing plates of seared sea bass and filet mignon cooked to precise temperatures. Daniel's new fiancé laughed too brightly at something his cousin whispered. Charlotte walked to the smaller table without protest, heels steady against polished marble, each step unhurried. If humiliation had a scent, it would have been the mix of expensive perfume and chilled champagne in the air. If it had a sound, it would have been silverware tapping china as conversations resumed. Daniel raised his glass at the main table. "To real family," he announced, smirking just slightly as he avoided looking directly at her. Charlotte met his gaze anyway. Her eyes were calm, reflective, unreadable. She lifted her own glass of sparkling water instead of wine. "Good luck tonight," she said softly. It wasn't loud enough to interrupt the toast, but it was clear enough for him to hear. Daniel's smile deepened, mistaking her composure for surrender. Around them, the city lights stretched for miles, endless and glittering, unaware that inside this carefully staged room, a quiet shift had already begun. Charlotte didn't need the main table.
She only needed time.
Charlotte Bennett sat at the smaller round table as the dinner continued, the hum of conversation swelling and fading like distant waves against glass. From her seat, she could see the entire main table reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows, Daniel at the center, leaning back with the confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. His hand rested possessively on the back of his fiancée's chair. He laughed easily, telling a story about expansion plans, about new investors, about projections climbing quarter after quarter. The people around him nodded with admiration, forks pausing midair as he spoke. Charlotte remembered another night years ago in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Queens, when Daniel had sat cross-legged on the carpet surrounded by unpaid invoices and empty takeout boxes. Back then, ambition sounded different. It had been quieter, edged with fear instead of pride. She had brewed coffee at 2 a.m. and opened her laptop, helping him rewrite pitch decks while he paced the living room. She had called her father the next day and asked about liquidating a portion of her small trust fund, not for luxury, but for payroll. Daniel had promised her that one day they would sit at the best table in any room. He had not mentioned that the seat beside him would become optional. The waiter approached Charlotte now with professional courtesy, asking if she needed anything else. She thanked him and declined dessert. Her phone lay face down near her plate, silent but not forgotten. A notification had come through earlier, confirming a finalized acquisition that had taken months to close. She had read it once, then locked the screen, choosing this moment to be fully present. Across the room, Daniel lifted his glass again, this time announcing a partnership that would supposedly secure his company's future for the next decade. Applause followed. Charlotte observed the details others missed, the slight tension in his jaw, the way he checked his watch too often, the faint crease between his brows when a server leaned in to whisper something. Money always looked stable from a distance. Up close, it revealed its fractures. She remembered the day the divorce papers were signed in a downtown office building with fluorescent lights and beige walls. Daniel had avoided eye contact then as well, speaking in terms of efficiency and clean breaks. He had framed it as growth, as evolution. Charlotte had nodded, signed where she was told, and walked out into a humid July afternoon where the air felt thick enough to swallow disappointment whole. She had not cried in public. Instead, she had gone home, opened a fresh notebook, and written 3 words at the top of the first page. Learn the numbers.
Over the next 2 years, she did exactly that.
She studied market cycles, attended seminars, met with advisors who did not recognize her last name as anything significant. She invested carefully, sometimes boldly, always deliberately. She built relationships quietly, favoring long conversations over loud announcements. Tonight, as Daniel basked in admiration at the main table, Charlotte felt none of the old sting. The exclusion had lost its power. It was merely information. The music shifted to a softer tempo, and servers began clearing plates in synchronized movements. A man in a tailored suit approached Daniel with a slim leather folder in his hand. It was routine, discreet, almost invisible to anyone not watching closely. Charlotte noticed. Daniel accepted the folder with the same casual authority he had displayed all evening. He did not open it immediately. He continued speaking, smiling, performing. Charlotte lifted her glass of water once more and took a measured sip, her gaze steady, patient. Time, she had learned, was far more valuable than a seat at any table. Daniel Harper let the leather folder rest beside his plate for a few more seconds, finishing a sentence about projected revenue as if numbers alone could bend reality to his will. The chandelier above the main table cast a soft amber glow over his expression, polishing the confidence he had worn all evening. Around him, glasses clinked, forks tapped porcelain, and the skyline shimmered beyond the glass like an audience that never blinked. At the smaller table, Charlotte Bennett watched without appearing to watch. She had learned that the most powerful position in any room was not always the most visible one. It was the one with the clearest view. Daniel finally slid his finger under the edge of the folder and opened it with the casual impatience of someone accustomed to being served. The first page held the itemized charges, each line precise, each bottle and entree accounted for down to the dollar. His lips curved faintly, almost amused. He turned the page. The total was larger than expected, but not catastrophic for a man who had just spent 20 minutes boasting about expansion and liquidity. A faint crease formed between his brows. He flipped to the final page. There, beneath the total and service fee, beneath the discreet note thanking him for choosing the establishment, was a printed line identifying the ownership group of the restaurant and its parent company. Bennett Holdings, majority stakeholder. For a moment, the noise around him seemed to stretch thin, as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire floor. He read the name again, slower this time. Across the room, Charlotte adjusted her posture, crossing one leg over the other with quiet composure. She did not reach for her phone. She did not signal to anyone. She simply existed in the space she had once been denied. The months after the divorce had not been dramatic. There had been no grand declarations, no social media reinventions, no public redemption arc. There had only been early mornings in a modest midtown apartment, coffee measured carefully, spreadsheets glowing on a 14-inch screen, and conversations with advisors who valued discipline over ego. She had studied hospitality portfolios when she noticed how often Daniel entertained clients at this particular rooftop. She had observed the frequency, the patterns, the dependency disguised as preference. When the previous majority owner quietly signaled an exit, Charlotte had recognized the opportunity not as revenge, but as leverage. She acquired her shares in stages, never attaching her name to the negotiations until the final documents were signed. Back at the main table, Daniel cleared his throat and closed the folder halfway, as if compressing the information could make it less real. His fiancée leaned toward him, whispering a question. He forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. One of his business partners glanced at the folder, curious. Daniel shifted it slightly away. The manager approached then, posture straight, expression respectful. He did not address Daniel first. He stepped past him and walked toward the smaller table. Conversations paused in subtle waves as he stopped. Beside Charlotte, and inclined his head. "Ms. Bennett," he said evenly, "we hope everything has met your expectations this evening." The title was not loud, but it carried. Daniel's gaze lifted slowly, the smirk from earlier now replaced by something tighter, less certain. Charlotte met the manager's eyes and offered a measured nod. "Everything is perfect," she replied. Her voice was calm, neither triumphant nor sharp. The manager returned to the main table and waited politely for Daniel's acknowledgement. In that suspended moment, the hierarchy of the room rearranged itself without a single raised voice. Charlotte did not move toward the chandelier or the orchids or the place cards written in looping script. She did not need to. The ownership line on a single sheet of paper had already redrawn the boundaries. 70 stories above the city, under lights designed to flatter every surface, the balance of power shifted quietly, and only one of them had seen it coming. The silence that followed the manager's greeting did not shatter the room, but it altered its temperature. Daniel Harper felt it first in the way his business partner stopped mid-sentence, in the way his fiancée slowly withdrew her hand from his sleeve. 70 stories above Manhattan, the skyline still glittered with indifference, but at the main table something invisible had tilted. Daniel forced a small laugh, the kind meant to smooth confusion into something harmless. "Small world," he said lightly, glancing toward Charlotte Bennett as if this were a coincidence he found amusing. She did not rush to respond. She did not stand to claim attention. She simply folded her napkin with precise movements and placed it beside her plate, as though concluding a quiet meal rather than concluding a chapter of her life. The manager remained poised between the two tables, posture professional, eyes neutral. He understood hierarchy better than anyone in the room. Ownership was not about volume. It was about signatures filed months before, about wires transferred before sunset, about names printed in contracts few people ever read. Daniel finally looked down again at the final page of the bill, at the line that refused to disappear. Bennett Holdings. Majority stakeholder. He calculated quickly, mentally retracing recent meetings, trying to remember if he had ever mentioned this restaurant during investor calls, if he had ever joked about charging dinners to the company account. The numbers he had boasted about earlier suddenly felt fragile, like glass balanced too close to an edge. At her smaller table, Charlotte observed the shift without satisfaction or bitterness. She had not purchased the restaurant for this moment alone. She had studied hospitality not because she loved fine dining, but because she understood patterns. Daniel preferred predictable luxuries. He returned to the same spaces, trusted the same waiters, believed comfort equaled control. Charlotte had built her portfolio on understanding those habits. After the divorce, while Daniel expanded aggressively into markets he barely researched, she had focused on assets that generated steady returns. Real estate with long leases. Boutique hotels with loyal clientele. Restaurants that executives chose for celebration dinners. She had attended shareholder meetings quietly, often sitting in the back row, listening more than speaking. When the opportunity to secure majority ownership emerged, she had negotiated with calm persistence. No press release.
No announcement.
Just paperwork and patience. Now the evidence rested in Daniel's trembling fingers. Around him, the main table sensed the imbalance even if they could not name it. One cousin reached for her wine glass and missed slightly, the stem clinking against the plate. Daniel straightened in his chair, reclaiming posture as if posture alone could restore dominance. "Well," he said, voice measured, "let us settle this." He reached for his credit card, sliding it into the folder with deliberate confidence. The manager accepted it, nodding once, then turned not toward Daniel but toward Charlotte again. "Ms. Bennett," he said respectfully, "as majority owner, you have the option to approve or waive this evening's charges." The room held its breath in a way that was almost polite. Charlotte rose then, not hurried, not theatrical. The silk of her dress caught the light as she stepped forward, heels steady against marble. She stopped at the edge of the main table, close enough for Daniel to see the steadiness in her eyes. "The staff has done exceptional work tonight," she said evenly. "Please add a 25% gratuity for them." She paused, letting the words settle. "As for the rest, Mr. Harper will handle his table." It was not cruel. It was not loud. It was simply accurate. Daniel's smirk, the one he had worn like a signature earlier, had vanished completely. In its place lingered the realization that power had never been about where she sat. It had been about what she owned. And tonight, under a chandelier designed to illuminate every flaw, the room finally understood which name truly carried weight. Daniel Harper kept his posture straight even after the manager stepped away with his credit card, but the ease that once framed his shoulders had tightened into calculation. The guests at the main table resumed their seats slowly, as if unsure whether they were still participants in a celebration or witnesses to a correction. The skyline beyond the glass remained unchanged, but inside the room the air felt thinner, sharper. Charlotte Bennet did not linger beside the orchids or the place cards written in elegant script. She returned to her smaller table with the same measured steps, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. A few eyes followed her now, not with pity, but with reassessment. Respect often arrived late, and it rarely announced itself. Daniel leaned toward one of his partners, lowering his voice, attempting to redirect attention toward projected revenue and pending deals. He spoke about growth curves and market dominance, about strategic positioning in competitive sectors. The words sounded rehearsed, but they lacked the effortless confidence he had displayed earlier in the evening. Across the room, Charlotte observed without appearing to. She remembered the first investor dinner Daniel had ever hosted, years ago in a modest steakhouse in Brooklyn where the ceiling tiles were stained and the wine list fit on a single page. She had sat beside him then, answering financial questions he was not yet prepared to handle. She had explained margins, overhead, and long-term sustainability while Daniel smiled proudly at her confidence. Back then, he had introduced her as his partner in every sense of the word. After the divorce, introductions had grown shorter. Eventually, they disappeared entirely. The manager returned with a leather folder, placing it gently in front of Daniel. "All set, sir," he said professionally. Daniel opened it again, scanning the receipt, confirming the gratuity Charlotte had requested for the staff. 25% on a bill approaching $50,000 was not insignificant, but it was precise, deliberate. He signed with a controlled hand, though the signature looked slightly heavier than usual. Charlotte stood once more, not to reclaim a seat at the main table, but to collect her coat from the back of her chair. The fabric was understated, tailored but unbranded, chosen for function rather than display. She slipped it on with quiet grace. A few guests shifted in their seats as she approached the main table one last time. Daniel met her gaze, searching perhaps for accusation, for triumph, for something dramatic that would allow him to respond. He found none. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," she said calmly, her voice steady and composed. There was no sarcasm in it. No lingering wound. Just closure. The elevator doors at the end of the private dining floor opened with a soft chime. Charlotte walked toward them without hesitation. Each step echoed lightly against the marble, not hurried, not hesitant. As she entered the glass elevator, the city unfolded beneath her in a grid of white and amber lights. 70 stories down, traffic continued, unaware of the recalibration that had just occurred above. Daniel remained seated at the main table, surrounded by crystal and linen and conversations that now felt forced. The chandelier still shimmered, but it no longer illuminated certainty. Charlotte watched the numbers descend on the elevator panel, reflecting briefly on how power had shifted not in a single dramatic strike, but through patience, study, and restraint. She had not asked for a place at his table. She had built her own. And as the elevator doors closed softly, sealing her inside a column of glass and light, it was clear that the night had never been about humiliation. It had been about ownership all along. The elevator descended in silence, a transparent column of glass, sliding down the spine of the building while Manhattan shimmered in precise lines of white and gold beneath Charlotte Bennet's steady gaze. Her reflection in the glass looked unchanged, calm, composed, almost detached, yet something subtle had shifted. Not in her posture, not in her expression, but in the finality of the evening. 70 stories above, Daniel Harper remained seated under the chandelier, replaying the sequence in his mind as if there had been a miscalculation he could still correct. When the elevator doors opened into the marble lobby, Charlotte stepped out into cooler air scented faintly with polished stone and expensive cologne. The doorman greeted her with a respectful nod, a small gesture that carried more sincerity than any applause at the main table. Outside, the October air brushed against her face, crisp and clean, the kind that sharpened thought. A black sedan waited at the curb. Not flashy, simply efficient. She slid into the back seat and watched the building's glass facade reflect the city lights like a vertical river of gold. Inside the dining room upstairs, conversations had fractured into careful fragments. Daniel attempted to restore momentum, but every topic circled back to the ownership line printed at the bottom of the receipt. His partner asked casual questions that were not casual at all. How long had Bennett Holdings been involved? Was this recent? Did it affect their hosting agreements? Daniel responded with controlled optimism, insisting it was irrelevant, that tonight had simply been a misunderstanding of visibility. Yet, he could not shake the memory of the manager addressing Charlotte first. In business, sequence mattered. Order revealed hierarchy. As the sedan moved through midtown traffic, Charlotte rested her hand lightly against the leather seat and allowed herself a single exhale she had held all evening. She did not feel triumph. She felt clarity. The years after the divorce had not been about revenge. They had been about education. She had taken night classes in corporate law, sitting beside students nearly a decade younger, absorbing language she once trusted Daniel to interpret. She had studied acquisition structures, majority shares, silent partnerships. She had met mentors who valued patience over performance. Slowly, deliberately, she had built a portfolio that did not rely on spectacle. The rooftop restaurant had been one piece among many, but it was a strategic one. She knew Daniel's habits because she had once shared them. She understood where he entertained clients, where he felt most impressive, where he believed control was absolute. Ownership was never about interrupting his dinner. It was about understanding leverage before he did. Back upstairs, the staff began clearing the main table more quickly than planned. The evening had ended earlier than scheduled, energy deflated by an invisible shift no chandelier could disguise. Daniel stood near the window now, looking out at the same skyline Charlotte had just left behind. From this height, the city appeared obedient, orderly, predictable. But markets were never predictable. Power was never permanent. And respect, once lost, rarely returned on command. In the back seat of the sedan, Charlotte glanced at her phone. Messages from her financial advisor confirmed the next board meeting date. Another notification referenced a boutique hotel acquisition closing next quarter. Life was moving forward, not sideways. As the car turned onto Park Avenue, the building faded into the background, just another tower among many. Charlotte did not look back. She had never needed the main table to define her place in the world. She had needed knowledge, timing, and restraint. And tonight, without raising her voice or reclaiming a seat, she had demonstrated that the quietest presence in the room could also be the one holding the keys. 2 weeks after the dinner, Daniel Harper sat alone in his corner office overlooking Midtown, staring at a printed portfolio summary he had not expected to receive. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight came not from ink but from implication. Bennett Holdings appeared again, not just beside the name of the rooftop restaurant, but threaded through multiple properties his company had recently relied on for client entertainment and corporate events. Boutique hotels, conference spaces, private dining venues. Each acquisition had been quiet, strategic, almost invisible. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair, the skyline framed behind him like a backdrop to a performance he no longer controlled. He replayed the night in his mind, the way the manager had addressed Charlotte first, the the way the room had recalibrated in a matter of seconds. He had dismissed it as symbolism. Now he understood it had been infrastructure. Across town, Charlotte Bennett stepped into a glass-walled boardroom on the 32nd floor of a different building, one she had invested in long before the market recognized its potential. Morning light streamed across the polished oak table as her advisory team reviewed quarterly reports. She listened more than she spoke, fingertips resting lightly on a tablet displaying occupancy rates and revenue projections. The rooftop restaurant had posted record bookings since the private event Daniel hosted. Public curiosity had a way of boosting business. She approved a plan to renovate the lower lounge, suggesting subtle changes in lighting and acoustics rather than dramatic redesign. Growth, in her view, was evolutionary, not explosive. Later that afternoon, Daniel requested a meeting. The email was formal, restrained, devoid of personal reference. He framed it as a strategic discussion between executives whose interests overlapped. Charlotte read it once, then responded with a concise confirmation. They met in a neutral conference suite overlooking Bryant Park, 15 floors above street level. The space was minimalist, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows. Daniel arrived. First, adjusting his cufflinks as if rehearsing authority. When Charlotte entered, she carried no visible tension. Her suit was tailored, navy, understated. She took her seat opposite him, posture relaxed, expression attentive. Daniel began with numbers. He spoke about expansion, about the necessity of aligning their portfolios for mutual benefit. He emphasized collaboration. He avoided the word control. Charlotte listened, occasionally nodding, allowing him to finish without interruption. When he paused, she folded her hands calmly on the table. Sustainable growth depends on stability, she said evenly. Stability depends on disciplined management. Her tone held no accusation, only clarity. Daniel recognized the subtext. His recent ventures had been aggressive, financed through leverage that assumed uninterrupted momentum. Charlotte's assets, in contrast, were anchored in long-term value. She outlined potential terms for partnership, not as concession, but as structure. The conditions were precise. Transparent accounting, conservative debt ratios, shared oversight on hospitality investments. Daniel understood that refusing outright would isolate him from properties his clients preferred. Accepting would require acknowledging her authority in spaces he once treated as extensions of his ego. Outside, Bryant Park carried on with quiet rhythm, pedestrians crossing in steady patterns below. Inside, the negotiation unfolded without raised voices or sharp gestures. This was not a confrontation of emotion. It was a correction of balance. When the meeting concluded, Daniel did not extend a performative handshake. He simply nodded, aware that the landscape had shifted permanently. Charlotte gathered her tablet and stood, offering the same measured composure she had maintained all along. As she stepped into the elevator, descending 15 floors toward the city, it was clear that the power she now held was not reactive. It was constructed, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The proposal Daniel Harper had received did not collapse his company overnight, but it narrowed his options with quiet precision. Over the following month, market pressure intensified in ways that felt coincidental to outsiders and intentional to anyone who understood timing. Two of his preferred event venues adjusted their corporate pricing structures. A luxury hotel chain he relied on for investor conferences revised its partnership requirements. Each change was justified by policy updates and long-term positioning, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Bennett Holdings appeared repeatedly in ownership disclosures, its reach extending farther than Daniel had initially calculated. In her 32nd floor office overlooking Bryant Park, Charlotte Bennett reviewed performance dashboards projected across a 12-foot screen. Occupancy rates were stable. Revenue per available room had climbed steadily. Restaurant bookings were secured 3 months in advance. She listened as her chief financial officer outlined risk assessments tied to several mid-sized firms that had expanded too quickly in the last fiscal year. Daniel's company was listed among them, not as a target, but as exposure. Charlotte did not react emotionally to the mention of his name. She requested detailed cash flow projections, and a sensitivity analysis under tightened credit conditions. Her voice remained even, analytical, focused on sustainability rather than spectacle. Later that week, Daniel attended an industry summit at a newly renovated conference center in Lower Manhattan. The space featured floor-to-ceiling glass, custom lighting, and acoustics engineered to soften even the sharpest remarks. He arrived prepared to present his company's growth trajectory to a room of potential partners. As he stepped onto the stage, he noticed the event branding displayed across the digital backdrop. The venue was operated by a subsidiary of Bennett Holdings. The realization registered not as shock, but as inevitability. He delivered his presentation with measured confidence, outlining projected earnings and strategic expansions. Applause followed, polite but restrained. During the networking session, several investors referenced Charlotte's recent acquisitions, praising her disciplined approach and diversified assets. Daniel responded diplomatically, emphasizing collaboration and alignment within the hospitality sector. He no longer framed her as incidental. He framed her as infrastructure. Across town, Charlotte attended a separate meeting with a consortium of private equity advisors. The conversation centered on long-term positioning in urban hospitality markets, particularly properties located above 30 floors, where exclusivity justified premium pricing. Charlotte spoke about resilience, about avoiding overextension, about building portfolios that could withstand economic fluctuation. She did not mention Daniel by name. She did not need to. Her strategy was visible in the data. Weeks passed, and the balance between their companies became increasingly interdependent. Daniel faced a choice that was less dramatic than surrender and more significant than pride. To maintain access to the venues and properties that sustained his client relationships, he would need to formalize a structured partnership under Charlotte's conditions. The agreement draft arrived on his desk on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Transparent accounting, conservative leverage ratios, shared oversight on hospitality expenditures. It was not punitive. It was protective. He read it slowly, understanding that acceptance would not diminish him publicly, but it would redefine the hierarchy he once assumed permanent. That evening, Charlotte stood by the window of her office as the sun lowered between glass towers, casting long reflections across the city. She did not feel vindicated. She felt aligned. The dinner weeks ago had not been the climax. It had been the unveiling of a foundation already built. Daniel signed the agreement the following morning. The signature was steady this time, deliberate. It marked not defeat, but recalibration. In the months that followed, their companies operated in parallel structure, interconnected through contracts rather than marriage. Industry publications began to reference Bennett Holdings as a stabilizing force in volatile markets. Daniel's firm adjusted its growth model, slower now, more measured. At a private industry dinner 6 months later, seating arrangements were different. No one questioned where Charlotte sat. No one questioned who controlled the venues. She did not request the center of the table. Influence had already granted it. And as conversation flowed beneath carefully calibrated lighting, it became clear that power, when constructed with patience and discipline, did not need to announce itself. It simply endured. 1 year after the night that quietly rearranged the balance between them, Charlotte Bennett stood once again beneath warm chandelier light, this time at an industry awards gala held inside a restored Beaux-Arts landmark overlooking the Hudson River. The ballroom ceiling rose nearly 40 feet above polished marble floors, and the guest list read like a directory of the most disciplined investors in urban hospitality. Bennett Holdings had been nominated for Strategic Portfolio of the Year, recognized for steady expansion without spectacle. Charlotte wore a tailored ivory gown, minimal jewelry, her hair swept back with understated precision. She did not skin the room for Daniel Harper. She no longer measured her presence against his. Daniel arrived later, accompanied by colleagues rather than fanfare. His company had stabilized over the past year, slower, leaner, less aggressive. The recalibration had preserved it. When he entered the ballroom, he noticed immediately that the seating chart placed Charlotte at the central table beside senior partners from major investment firms. His own table was nearby, respectable but no longer dominant. There was no sting in the arrangement. Only clarity. As dinner progressed, speakers referenced Bennett Holdings as a model of disciplined leadership. They spoke about long-term thinking, about acquisitions that strengthen communities, rather than inflated headlines. Charlotte listened with composed attention, offering brief acknowledgments when her name was mentioned. She did not embellish her achievements. She credited her team, her advisors, the value of measured growth. Across the room, Daniel watched not with resentment, but with recognition. He understood now what he had once dismissed.
Control was not volume.
It was foresight. During the intermission, guests circulated beneath crystal light, exchanging business cards and quiet congratulations. Daniel approached Charlotte with a professional nod. There was no smirk this time, no attempt at superiority. "You built something enduring," he said simply. Charlotte regarded him with steady eyes that carried neither triumph nor bitterness. "So did you," she replied evenly. "Just differently." The orchestra resumed, and guests returned to their seats. When the final award of the evening was announced, Bennett Holdings was named recipient. Applause filled the ballroom, sustained and genuine. Charlotte rose and walked to the stage with the same calm cadence she had carried into every boardroom over the past year. She accepted the glass award, its edges catching the light like quiet fire. At the podium, she did not recount the obstacles of her past or the night she had once been directed to a smaller table. She spoke instead about resilience, about building foundations that do not depend on applause. "True growth," she said, her voice clear across the hall, "comes from understanding what lasts." There was no need to mention loss. No need to mention humiliation. The room understood substance when it saw it. As the evening concluded and guests filtered toward the exit, the river outside reflected the city's skyline in steady silver lines. Daniel paused near the doorway as Charlotte prepared to leave. "Congratulations," he said, extending his hand. She shook it, firm and unguarded. There was no rivalry left in the gesture, only acknowledgement. Outside, cool night air carried the distant sound of traffic along the West Side Highway. A black sedan waited at the curb once more, understated and efficient. Charlotte stepped inside, the award resting beside her on the leather seat. Through the window, she caught a final glimpse of the ballroom's golden light fading behind her. She had never needed to reclaim a seat at someone else's table. She had learned to design her own. And as the car moved forward along the river, the skyline unfolding in disciplined geometry ahead, it was clear that her victory had not been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about proving herself steady. She had not won him back. She had won herself.